Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Looking a little worse for a little worse for wear right now, but here for you guys to do another video. Um, yeah, so this video comes courtesy of my co-host Lisa. She gave me this information. I was at school that day. I didn't watch uh, the event as it went down. Jimmy Carter's funeral. Just a couple of takeaways from the funeral of President Carter I wanted to talk about. One was Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin, his uh, former congressman, did a speech for Carter. He talked about how when he was, you know, growing up as a kid, there was segregation, obviously, Jim Crow era. And during that Jim Crow era was Jimmy Carter. He was running for governor, and we talked about it on the channel before, how he stepped up and um, he spoke against segregation, which was brave for a Southern governor to do at the time, because in those days, to get votes in the South, you had to be down with segregation, especially be in the position that Jimmy Carter was in, a Democrat. The Democratic Party was the party at that time during the 1970s, the late 60s and early 70s, the party of segregation. And Southern governors had to uh, capitulate to their Southern constituencies that were also pro segregation. This was the thing with George Wallace. Many people don't know that although George Wallace in his 1964, 1968, and 1972 campaigns was all about segregation. Initially, complete segregation, but then after 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 the Voting Rights Act, when it was passed into law that it was no longer the case, it became more opaque, it became more hidden, and the street started to talk in the early 70s about busing, including President Biden also made a speech against busing. When he was running for um, Congress, and that was just Delaware. That was uh, an, like a border state. It wasn't even really the deep South. It wasn't like it was Jimmy Carter with Georgia or Wallace with Alabama. That was just Delaware. But even he capitulated, to the Southern constituency that was heavily racist. We know that over time, you know, uh, those Southern voters, those Dixiecrat voters, moved to the Republican Party. Especially Carter was the candidate that really put his foot in the sand as governor, running for governor, and then later running for president in '76. That he was not going to capitulate to those voters. He was going to stand on his own and stand against that. So that caused the Southern voters to gradually leave and migrate over to the Republican Party. So by the time of his reelection in 1980, uh, the Republicans had began to court them. They started to court them in '68, courted them a little bit in '72, but in both '68 and '72, there were um, there were still Dixiecrats in the party. But by 1980, they were completely gone, and the Republicans started to cater to them with the Southern strategy. President Reagan started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where three civil rights workers, um, two white and one black, Michael Schwarmer, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, were lynched. You know what I mean? So And he started off by saying, "I am for states' rights." Anybody that studied American history knows exactly what states' rights means. According to the Southern narrative, the myth of the the myth of the South, as it were, the lost cause myth states that the war between the states from 1861 to 1865 was not fought over slavery, but was fought for states' rights. Sometimes they use the phrase property rights, but we know what it means. I mean, the Dred Scott decision of 1857 um, determined, that no matter where you go, in what part of the country, slave state, free state, what have you, um, uh, black people were chattel slavery and property. But what Lloyd Austin is saying is Jimmy Carter stuck his neck out, and Jimmy Carter, defied that. Was the first Southern governor, first Southern politician to go left, so left that the entire country turned against him, but he risked his neck out for African Americans. So his speech was pretty touching. Jimmy Carter's grandson also, the speech was pretty touching, talking about how when his grandfather got his first cell phone, he was trying to take a picture, but he called him by accident. The grandson says, "Who's this?" The grandson picks up the phone. Carter goes, "Who's this?" He goes, "But you called me." He said, "I wasn't trying to call you. I was trying to take a selfie." And then he's like, "Oh, he's a nuclear scientist," which he was, but technology is new. And then he talks about how through deregulation, Carter deregulated the beer industry. Carter, um, he calls us, he was for conservation. He calls his grandfather the first millennial, which I thought was pretty cool. Um, Gerald Ford's son got up and gave a speech as well. Gerald Ford's son talked about how, now keep in mind, uh, these were rivals. These two were rivals in the 1976 election. Gerald Ford, Republican Party, for the incumbent president. Of course, we talked about what happened, the incident with Nixon. Nixon resigned. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned. So Gerald Ford, who was the Speaker of the House, was moved up first to vice president and then to president. And it was a very vicious campaign between the two, between Carter and Ford. So each one of them said that whichever one dies first will give the eulogy. So if Carter had died first, Gerald Ford would have gave his eulogy, and if Carter had, and if um if Gerald Ford died first, Carter would give his eulogy. Well, Gerald Ford did pass away first. He passed away in 2000. They made an agreement to give each other's eulogy. So since Gerald Ford was already passed away and not able to make it, Gerald Ford's son, of course, made it, and he talked about the friendship, and it was an amazing friendship, even though they were of political opposites. And this often happens with presidents. Um, Most famously, we know of the story of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both founding fathers, one from Virginia, one from Massachusetts. Even back then, um, Virginia and Massachusetts had tremendous differences. Virginia was liberal. Virginia was a free state. Virginia was a Puritan state. Virginia was, excuse me, Virginia wasn't a Puritan state. Virginia was conservative, and Virginia was an Anglican state. Massachusetts, pardon me, Massachusetts was a liberal state. Massachusetts was founded by a Puritan and Pilgrim state. The first Thanksgiving, of course, takes place within the New England area. Virginia has a different story. Virginia is much older. The Virginia colony, the Jamestown colony, was founded in 1607. The Massachusetts Bay Colony wasn't founded until the 1620s. And a lot of the rivalry that goes on between conservative and liberal in this country has its roots in the English Civil War, which is a much older Civil War. What happened basically in the English Civil War was that there were some people in England that supported a parliamentary system, a purely parliamentary system, to the abolishment of the monarch, and there were others, and they were called the parliamentarians, and there were others who were called the royalists that supported limiting Parliament's power and government, and some completely abolishing the Parliament, and those were the royalists. The royalists tend to be the conservatives, and the parliamentarians, of course, tend to be the liberal. There's always been that tension. There's always been that tension between those elements in English society. So that carries over here. Parliamentarians tend to gravitate towards the New England states, where they are more independent from the king and the Church of England, because that was the point of the revolution that the Pilgrims were facilitating. It was a revolution not only against the crown itself, but against the English Church, the Anglican Church, right? So they wanted to move away from the Anglican Church, an area of society that was free from Anglicanism, whereas those in Virginia, which became the template for the southern states, they had a slave-based society, they had an aristocratic society, they had an autocratic society based on the English monarch. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they were political rivals, both believing in republicanism, but believing it in different ways, right? John Adams was more pro-English, whereas Thomas Jefferson was pro-French, and we saw that in their different presidencies. Thomas Jefferson mainly goes after the French, and mainly goes after the English that are antagonizing American ships on the high seas, whereas John Adams goes after mainly the French and goes after even French citizens of the United States. But but in 1826, on July 4th, 1826, both these men pass away. So once political rivals becoming political friends. So just like Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, just like Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, just like in many ways we saw it too, President Donald Trump and Barack Obama here at this ceremony, laughing it up. And we know President Trump and President Barack Obama were political rivals on opposite ends of the spectrum for many years, even up until this last campaign. Barack Obama campaigned against Donald Trump with Kamala Harris. Um, Donald Trump started his political career against Barack Obama with the birther controversy, but it seemed like here they were laughing it up. So this often happens. So Ford's son spoke warmly of Carter. So this has happened in history, and it's happening. It continues to happen to this day. Um, Other takeaways. Once again, too, um, George W. Bush patting Barack Obama on the stomach, disappointed, I guess, that Michelle wasn't there. We know Michelle and George W. Bush are really close with each other. I think he has somewhat of a crush on Michelle, former First Lady Michelle Obama, whatever. But there was a comment that Gerald Ford's son made saying that it's hard enough to get two presidents in a room. And Douglas Emhoff, who's Kamala Harris's husband, he was sitting next to her. He looks around and he sees all these presidents: Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, uh, all the living presidents all around. It was really cool, funny. But that's pretty much it, guys. Not really feeling up to making a video, but just wanted to make a short little video on some of the observations I saw. Thank you, Lisa, for this suggestion. Peace. Love you guys.